Reports, the president has said that the country will permanently ban cobalt exporters that violate its new quota system. The DRC is the world's top producer of cobalt, which is a critical electric battery metal. Now, the country provided around 70% of the global supply output last year. Now, back in February, the country suspended cobalt exports after prices fell to a 9-year low. The ban was extended in June. Last month, the country announced that it will lift the cobalt export ban on the 16th of October, and that the ban will be replaced by the annual export quotas. Here is a breakdown of the new cobalt export quotas. For the rest of 2025, miners will be allowed to ship up to 18,125 metric tons. For 2026 and 2027, annual caps of 96,600 tons will be imposed. The president has warned that exemplary sanctions will be imposed on violators of the new system. The DRC government has introduced the annual export quota system to stabilize the cobalt prices and to curb fraud. Now, according to reports, the president has said that the export freeze helped to drive a 92% rebound in cobalt prices since March.
What if I told you that Africa, a continent long underestimated by the West, now controls the most important resources powering the global economy? What if I told you that the minerals inside your phone, your Tesla, your laptop, your military systems, your electric grids, now depend on decisions made in Africa? Not Washington, not Brussels, not Berlin. The world is changing faster than most people realize. DR Congo holds over 70% of the world's cobalt. Zambia is rising as a copper giant. Zimbabwe is sitting on massive lithium reserves. Namibia just blocked Western companies from exporting raw minerals, and South Africa remains a platinum powerhouse. Together, this mineral network forms the backbone of the $25 trillion global clean energy and high-tech economy. And Africa is no longer handing it away. For the first time in modern history, Africa has said, we will control, refine, and profit from our own mineral wealth. This shift has stunned the United States and Europe, and the geopolitical consequences are massive. EV companies are panicking. Battery manufacturers are scrambling. Western governments are rewriting mineral strategy. China is strengthening its partnerships in Africa. Africa is rising to the negotiating table with unprecedented power. Today, we break down exactly what just happened, how Africa took control, and why the West cannot afford to ignore this power shift. This is the mineral war the mainstream media won't explain. But we will. The world did not see this coming. For decades, Africa was described by analysts in Washington, Brussels, and London as a resource-rich but powerless region. A continent that held enormous minerals, but almost none of the control. But that era is over. Because in a single coordinated wave, African nations have just rewired the global mineral supply chain. A supply chain worth over $25 trillion, and the United States and Europe are suddenly scrambling to respond. The moment everything changed, this shift did not begin with a single announcement. It began with multiple African countries making bold strategic moves all at once. DR Congo halted major cobalt exports and restructuring deals. Zimbabwe banned raw lithium exports. Namibia restricted unprocessed rare earth shipments. Tanzania renegotiated nickel and gold extraction contracts. Zimbabwe, Zambia, and the DRC formed a new EV battery mineral alliance. These were not isolated events. For the first time in modern history, African leaders were coordinating, negotiating, and setting their own mineral terms, not accepting dictation from the West. This is the continent that holds 80% of the world's cobalt, 40% of global manganese, 70% of coltan, used in phones and microchips, 30% of the world's bauxite, huge unexplored rare earth deposits. Over $20 trillion in untapped mineral value in the DRC alone. These numbers were always known. But the control of these numbers was not. How Africa took back control. Step 1. No more raw exports. African governments finally realized the truth. The richest places in the world are not those that export minerals, but those that refine and process them. So African countries began banning the export of unprocessed minerals. Zimbabwe said, no more raw lithium leaving the country. Namibia said, no more raw rare earths, only refined products. DR Congo said, no more mining deals that benefit foreign investors over the Congolese people. This forced global corporations, especially in the US and EU, to face a hard reality. If they want African minerals, they must now build African factories. Step 2. New mineral alliances. Historically, African countries negotiated separately and were easily overpowered. Not anymore. This new era saw the DRC, Zambia EV battery partnership, Southern African lithium cooperation, Pan-African rare earth coordination, BRICS mineral strategy with South Africa. This alliance approach increases bargaining power and reduces dependency on Western buyers. For the first time, Africa is acting like a unified commodity powerhouse, not a scattered collection of exporters. Step 3. Infrastructure backed by new partners. China, India, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia are investing billions into rail lines, battery manufacturing plants, refineries, logistics corridors. Special economic zones, ports built specifically for mineral processing. For decades, the U.S. and Europe refused to fund African mineral infrastructure beyond extraction. Now, new partners actually fund processing and manufacturing, giving Africa power the West never expected. Why the West is stunned? Because the West built its entire green energy plan on the assumption that Africa would remain passive. Europe's EV revolution depends on African cobalt and manganese. America's semiconductor supply chain depends on African coltan. Global aerospace depends on African titanium. But until recently, US and EU industries believed Africa would continue exporting raw minerals cheaply. Prices would remain dominated by Western buyers. Political divisions would prevent African coordination. China would remain the only serious competitor. Instead, Africa has flipped the script. For the first time ever, Africa is deciding the terms of the mineral market. This is equivalent to an oil-producing nation taking control of a trillion-dollar energy pipeline. Except this time, the product is what powers electric cars, smartphones, satellites, and AI data centers. The West's worst fear is now reality. 1. Price control. If African nations raise prices, the global EV industry shakes. If they limit exports, Western supply chains grind to a halt. If they prioritize local processing, Western companies face higher costs. 2. Resource nationalism is spreading. Countries in Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia are beginning to copy African policies. Africa is becoming the model for global resource control, not the follower. 3. China gains ground. China has spent 20 years investing in refineries, processing plants, supply chain routes, mining infrastructure. Now that Africa is restricting raw exports, China, not the West, already has the infrastructure to meet the new requirements. This means US and EU companies are 2 decades behind. The US and Europe's panic response. Western governments are attempting the following: urgent diplomatic missions to African capitals, emergency talks on rare earth access, new incentives for US and European companies to invest in Africa, new funding packages to counter China's influence, fast-tracked mining deals in Morocco, South Africa, and Namibia. But the problem is simple. The West is reacting. Africa is leading. For decades, African leaders listened to lectures about free markets, open competition, and global supply chains. Now those same governments are requesting urgent access to minerals they long took for granted. This is not just a shift. It is a power transfer. Africa is no longer the raw material supplier of the world. Africa is becoming the global mineral gatekeeper, the center of the EV battery supply chain, the world's fastest growing refining zone, the future of semiconductor materials. The new players setting global resource prices. For the first time, the continent has realized that minerals are not just resources. They are leverage. And with that leverage, Africa is reshaping global geopolitics. The shockwaves began quietly, but when the numbers were confirmed, Western analysts finally admitted what they had been denying for years. Africa wasn't just improving its bargaining power. Africa was re-engineering the global commodity hierarchy. And at the center of the storm were 3 minerals now classified by the US, EU, Japan, and China as ultra-critical for national security: cobalt, copper, rare earth elements, RE, and Africa controls a dominant share of all 3. But here is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. For the first time in over 100 years, African nations are not allowing these resources to leave the continent raw. The West's greatest fear has come true. Africa is moving from supplier to controller. For decades, Western companies structured contracts that allowed them to extract minerals cheaply, ship them abroad, refine them in Europe or China, and sell them back to Africa at enormous markups. But in late 2024 and early 2025, African governments passed new rules. No more exports of unprocessed minerals. If European or American companies want access, they must build refineries in Africa, create local industrial jobs, partner with African state-owned companies, share technology, agree to long-term infrastructure trade-offs. This is what panicked Washington and Brussels. Because once Africa refines its own minerals, it controls the pricing, the supply chain, and the value addition. And value addition is where the money explodes. Example: exporting raw cobalt equals $40 per ton profit. Exporting refined battery-grade cobalt sulfate equals $8,000 plus per ton profit. The difference isn't small. It is civilization shifting. For years, Western intelligence agencies assumed that Africa lacked industrial capacity, infrastructure, capital, technical know-how, regional political unity, but they forgot two powerful forces that changed everything. 1. China built the infrastructure. 2. Young African governments built the policy. Over the last decade, China financed over 13,000 kilometers of new rail across Africa. Energy grids improved in Kenya, Morocco. South Africa gigafactories began rising in Zambia, DRC, Tanzania. African universities increased engineering programs. Regional mining alliances were formed. And when African presidents realized the West was desperate for minerals to fuel EV production, tech manufacturing, and military systems, they did something the West never expected. They united. And unity changed the global equation overnight. To strengthen control, African nations formed the African Critical Minerals Alliance, ACMA. Members include DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique. The goals: set unified prices, coordinate export policy, control supply, build regional refining centers, create a mineral reserve bank, force foreign investors into value addition compliance. This is Africa's version of OPEC, but bigger, because unlike oil, critical minerals have no substitutes. Across the continent, massive industrial projects are now rising. Lithium processing plants in Zimbabwe, copper refineries in Zambia, cobalt sulfate plants in the DRC, EV battery precursor factories in Tanzania, solar panel manufacturing in Morocco, and for the first time ever, African minerals are being turned into African-made technology. This is what terrifies the West the most. Because once Africa owns the minerals, the refineries, the manufacturing, the pricing power, the global supply chain shifts permanently. Even if the US or Europe launches new sanctions, new trade agreements, new diplomatic pressure, new mining incentives, it won't work. Why? Because Africa now has alternatives. China, India, Gulf states, BRICS Plus, and Southeast Asia are offering better loans, infrastructure, technology partnerships, refining joint ventures, military cooperation. The West is no longer the only option. Africa has leverage, and leverage changes everything.